all of that. All right, so I have the recording on. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to start by making some general comments. And so for the first part of what I'm going to say, I am going to mute us, all right? If, however, you have any questions during my preliminary observations, please write them down, or if you would like, you can note them in the chat section, and I will respond to them. And I promise you, I will give you all plenty of time to both ask questions and to make statements or observations about our topic this evening. So I'd like to begin with certain things that I don't think are controversial. I would like to begin with truths about the American-Israeli relationship that I think have been true throughout the years since Israel became a state and even before that on. First of all, my first statement, I don't think anybody can dispute it, is that the relationship between Israel and the United States is not only unique and special, but it has also been a critical relationship for both countries, for both parties. Israel has long regarded the United States not only as its closest ally, but also as the guarantor of Israel's security and its international standing. Ever since 1948, when Israel was declared a state during the Truman administration, until today, Israel has been able to look to no other country in the world like the United States, both to protect its interests and also a place that shares the same kind of democratic and moral values that Israel itself espouses. So the unique nature of the US-Israel relationship remains unique. Administrations come, administrations go, but the truth of the matter is what binds us together as two countries is far more endurable than any temporary change in governments or personalities, more enduring than any rifts that may occur over time between these two great countries. The United States, for its part, I talked about Israel's dependence and its reliance on the United States. The United States, for its part, not only sees in Israel a reliable democratic ally in the Middle East, not only sees a country that shares a great many of the moral and ethical and religious values that we here in this country cherish, but has also valued Israel both as a military and an intelligence asset in the Middle East. Israel is a country which has not asked the United States or any other powers for that matter to fight on its behalf. One of the unique things about Israel is that it sees to its own defense, it looks to its own security. It does hope to have the support and the understanding of other nations of the world, but Israelis understand that the struggle that they are in is their own struggle, and they do not depend upon any other country to fight its battles for them. Having said that, the United States has come to see in Israel a valuable ally, both because of Israel's intelligence assets, because of Israel's presence in the Middle East as a stabilizing force in an area that is inherently subject to change and instability. The United States has come to value the fact that Israel is there. I will just tell you that if Israel did not exist, what the US would have to expend in money and in intelligence and in resources to maintain stability in the Middle East would be far more than it gives to Israel each year to support Israel's ongoing programs. So this is a two-way relationship between the United States and Israel that is mutually beneficial to both parties. Both parties derive benefit from their ongoing relationship. Now, having said that, I want to make a second observation. I believe that we are now, and this is not something that I can prove to you, but based upon everything that I see happening in the world, which we will talk about tonight, I believe we are at a kind of crossroad in the nature of the relationship and the importance of the relationship between Israel and the United States. Both governments, both the Israeli government and the US government, have inherited a relationship that has many of the same issues that they have always dealt with. But these relationships and these issues have become even more demanding in light of the increasingly divided political and domestic considerations in each country. What do I mean by that? Up until this year, two personalities dominated the Israel-American relationship. On the American side, there was President Donald Trump, and on the Israeli side, there was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. One can make a good case that the nature of the Israeli-American relationship was also a function of the ongoing relationship between these two leaders in these two different countries. They were not only close on certain issues, but both men had certain problems that each was facing. They could relate to the problems of the other. And to a large extent, American-Israeli relationships over the last 4 years reflected the unique situation in Israel with the Netanyahu government and the situation during the 4 years of Donald Trump. President Biden and Prime Minister Bennett have inherited this relationship from their predecessors, but I don't think I have to tell you that the nature of these men is a little bit different, if not quite different, from the relationship between the two leaders who preceded them up until this year. In January of this past year, Joseph Biden became president of the United States. About 6 months later, in June, Naftali Bennett was elected to be the Prime Minister of Israel. In both cases, two very strong personalities were replaced both in the United States and Israel by two men who were quite different in terms of both philosophy, but also in terms of style. The interesting thing was not only that the nature of the leadership changed, but both Biden and Bennett inherited rather unstable governments. I think in order to understand the Israeli-American situation, you have to understand that neither Biden nor Bennett enjoys a really stable government. They lead a government that is divided, both of them, that tilts back and forth, that is tumultuous, and where it is difficult to determine who is where and how things are going to turn out. Bennett is the head of a coalition of 8 political parties from across Israel's spectrum who have widely different political, religious, ideological differences. The one thing that brought these 8 coalition partners together was their desire to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, the one thing that brought all of these parties together basically was the realization that they did not want to have another term of Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, by the way, in his most recent incarnation, has been the Prime Minister of Israel for the last 12 years. So the coalition that came together largely came together with the idea of removing Bibi from office. In the case of the American situation, it would seem to be quite different. The administration is Democratic. The House is Democratic. Even the Senate, you can argue, with Kamala Harris's vote is Democratic. You might think Joe Biden has an easier time of it. But when you realize that the division between the Congress, between the House and the Senate is so close, and you have two very fractious parties in the United States that are constantly at war with each other and differing about one issue after another, then you can see that even in America, the large number of issues that we confront, the widely divergent views of American political leaders on all issues, including Israel and America's relationship, are bound to create a situation where it is going to be difficult to understand what will take place in the coming year. Both Israel and America, my next contention, I'm just making my contentions first. Both Israel and America face domestic and foreign problems. For Israel, it's rather clear. Israel continues to exist in a situation of tension in the Middle East. It continues to go between periods of normality and periods of attack in the territories in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip with Hamas, in the north of Israel, to the north of Israel with Lebanon and Hezbollah, with Syria, with Lebanon, and of course with Iran. Israel faces a number of issues, both domestic and political, quite apart from the fact that Israel is confronted now with another bout of the COVID virus. Israel, like America, is now dealing with a new wave of coronavirus, the Omicron variation. The United States, for its part, is also involved in is also divided about a number of different issues, both foreign and domestic. US relationship with Russia and what is happening between Russia and the Ukraine and the possibility of a conflict between the two powers and what that might mean not only for the United States, but for all of the Western, the NATO powers, is a subject that is consuming a lot of time of a lot of diplomats in Washington right now. The whole question of the ongoing relationship between the United States and China represents a very interesting question as to what is going to happen in US-Chinese relations on a number of issues in the coming year. When you add to that the ongoing situation in Iran and the talks that are taking place now on the attempt to restart the nuclear deal, when you add to that rumblings in North Korea, instability in the Middle East, including a post-evacuation Afghanistan, when you add to that domestic issues like domestic violence in this country, the COVID virus, the immigration crisis on the borders of the US, when you add all of these issues together, you see that both Israel and the United States are confronting foreign and domestic issues that are going to tax the leadership. Even if they were united, it would be a difficult program. But given the divisions in both Israel and in America, these issues, any one of them could threaten the working relationship and the ability of these governments to face these particular crises. I am going to deal with tonight what I consider to be the major issues of the Israel-US relationship. There are, to my way of thinking, about 3 or 4 basic issues. I'm going to lay them out rather quickly for you in the next 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. And then I'm going to invite all of you to join the discussion to further explore the direction relationships will take. First of all, without question, the number one issue that confronts both Israel and the United States is the renewed negotiations that are taking place right now in Vienna, negotiations designed to restart the nuclear agreement issue with Iran. Just a little bit of background. In 1915, Western governments throughout the world, including the Obama administration in Washington, concluded an agreement with Iran that called for Iran to adhere to certain restrictions designed to stop their attempt to develop nuclear weapons. These nuclear talks were designed to restrain Iran, to cause it to step back from enriching uranium to weapons grade, and causing Iran to step back from the terrible prospect that it was going to develop nuclear weapons. In 2015, these nuclear arrangements were concluded, And they were abided by until in 2018, Donald Trump made the decision to remove the United States from the nuclear agreements, from these agreements with Iran. Trump withdrew from the 2015 deal. I should say he withdrew with the active support and the encouragement of the Israeli government at the time. And ever since 1918, the United States has reinstated a number of sanctions on the Iranian government, insisting that certain conditions be met before the United States will relieve them from these sanctions and will go ahead and reestablish new talks and the new understanding. Okay. The Biden administration right now is involved in trying to resurrect this nuclear deal. They are in Vienna. Very little progress has been made so far. Both sides seem to be playing hardball. But the basic idea is that in return for the reduction of sanctions, the United States wants Iran to agree to a whole series of steps that it had previously agreed to. In addition, it wants Iran to roll back certain developments that occurred in the last 3 years when Iran wasn't under strict monitoring by the World Atomic Energy Control Groups. So the United States is calling for Iran to reaffirm its support for the agreements, but the United States would like additional agreements to guarantee not only that Iran does not continue to develop nuclear weapons, but they want other guarantees too, involving other kinds of technology that will guarantee that Iran does not become a dangerous military power in the Middle East. Iran, for its part, believes that the United States wrongly terminated this agreement, and they are essentially demanding that without preconditions, the United States return to the nuclear talks from the exact point that they left off, with no preconditions. And more than that, Iran is asking that prior to the start of any new talks or any new negotiations, that the United States and any Western countries or companies that are complying with it immediately end all the sanctions and all the restrictions that have been placed on Iran since 2018. And Iran seems to insist that without that return to the talks with no preconditions, that Iran is unwilling to go back and sit and talk again. And that's where things currently sit. Now, the red lines are very clear. What is the problem here? Everybody knows what the red lines are. The red lines are, we don't want Iran to be able to develop the potential for the use of nuclear weapons. But the red lines between Israel and the United States are a little bit different. Let me tell you what the two red lines are. And this is why Israel and the United States see the situation in Iran a little bit differently. Israel, for its part, Israel's red line is the point in which Iran develops sufficient enriched uranium to produce one nuclear bomb. Okay, that's Israel's red line. Iran has been continuing to enrich uranium. We know that. They have continued to develop their centrifuge technology. They have continued to try and procure on the open or the black market elements of their nuclear program. Israel is concerned at the point where Iran has produced enough fusionable material, enough enriched uranium to produce one bomb, that may be the point of no return as far as Israel is concerned. It might be the point at which whatever happens won't be able to turn back the clock and guarantee Israel's existential existence. The United States, which is a little farther away from Iran and not as close to territories in the Middle East, and to this day, Iran has not developed ICBM capabilities. It doesn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. The United States red line is a little bit different. The United States red line is the point where Iran develops not just the enriched uranium, not where it just has enough enriched uranium to produce a bomb, but also the point in which Iran develops the other kinds of technology, including the explosives devices and creating the bomb and the missiles to carry these weapons. That is the red line for the United States. So for Israel, the red line is a little bit more immediate than for the United States, but both countries realize that there is a point at which, when Iran crosses that line, that it's going to be very hard to stop them. And by the way, if you're wondering how much time we are talking, it is believed that if Iran decided to go ahead to develop a nuclear weapon and the means of being able to deliver it, if they started right now, the experts believe that the time necessary for developing a nuclear weapon and being able to actually utilize it is about 1.5 to 2 years. Now, 1.5 to 2 years may sound like a lot of time to you, but it is a very, very short period of time. Within that period, if Iran decided to pursue it, if it decided to break out and to go on its own, it could not only develop the material, the nuclear, enrich the uranium that it needed, but could also complete the technology that was required to be able to deploy nuclear weapons. And that assumes that they do a lot of that work themselves. That assumes that China or other interested parties, Pakistan, whatever, don't assist them in the process. If that were the case, that 1.5 to 2 year breakout time would be shortened. Now, here is the point. That breakout time is a window of opportunity. That is the point. That 1.5 to 2 years is the time we can stop them. Once a country becomes a nuclear power, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once a country develops the capability of producing and mounting nuclear weapons, it changes everything. It's the difference between negotiations with Iran and the negotiations with North Korea. When a country has entered the nuclear club, it is a whole different ballgame. And so, if the worst were to happen and Iran were to pursue a nuclear device, a nuclear capability, within 1.5 to 2 years, that is the window of opportunity for a US or an Israeli military response to either stop or to delay the Iranians. You're talking about a 1.5 to 2 year period of time. The other issue, apart from preventing Iran from obtaining this nuclear capability, is the realization that if Iran is given the relief it wants, if the sanctions are removed, that Iran will use the money that is generated from being free of those sanctions to create other kinds of problems in the Middle East and to purchase other kinds of weaponry and to subsidize other kinds of terrorist groups to cause mischief in the area. So the secondary question is not only what will deter Iran from obtaining nuclear capability, but what kinds of restrictions are going to be necessary to guarantee that the Iranians do not develop the financial resources that will enable them to be a nefarious player in the politics of the Middle East. And this is an issue that concerns not just Israel and not just the United States. It concerns Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt. It concerns a lot of players. And it is not Israel alone that is worried about Iranian nuclear capability. Countries in the Middle East, indeed many countries throughout the world, understand that we are dealing here with an issue which, if it is not addressed and handled properly, will come back to pose a nightmare for the entire world. Israel hopes, and here's the question, negotiations are now going forward. Israel is putting strong pressure on the Western governments to get a good deal. I don't think Israel believes it's going to be able to stop a new deal or a reinstitution of the nuclear talks. I think Israel believes that at the end of the day, unless the Iranians prove completely recalcitrant, that the Western powers will find a way of concluding an agreement to renew nuclear talks. But what Israel hopes is that if a new agreement is reached, it will include safeguards that protect not only Israel, but other countries from Iranian duplicity and from cheating. It will guarantee a strict regime of monitoring that will make sure that the Iranians are not able to slip under the wires and to secretly develop or produce or bring up their technology to the point where at a certain point they can throw the observers out and then go ahead and make a mad dash for final weaponry. That is the hope. And to that end, Israel is urging the US and the other Western actors to maintain, even if there is a new agreement struck, to maintain some sanctions in place to ensure that the Iranians comply with whatever agreements are made, and to guarantee that the Iranians will follow through with the knowledge that if they cheat, if they are caught doing things which are improper, that there will be a snapback, that immediately these sanctions will be immediately reimposed, and that the world collectively and together will do what they have to do to stop the Iranian regime from pursuing nuclear weaponry. That, in short, is the Iranian connection between Israel and the United States. Both countries have common interests, although obviously Israel is in a different position than the United States. Both countries are quietly working together in an effort to try and put together a strategy that will contain Iran and guarantee some kind of stability in the Middle East. Now, let me go to the second of the three areas that I think are the areas I want to cover tonight. The second area is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ever since Israel was formed in 1948 until today, there has been obviously a question of what is the nature of the relationship between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including both the Palestinians who live within the territories of Israel, but more importantly, the overall relationship between Israel and its Arab neighbors in the Middle East. In some respects, though Joe Biden has taken steps to reverse certain steps that Donald Trump took when he was president, it is interesting to point out that there are far more areas where Biden has continued Trump's policies than areas where he has differed. Let me mention some of those policies with you. First of all, like Trump, Biden has continued to emphasize the importance of the American-Israeli relationship. Now, this is important because there are some factions in the political parties that would like to see a weaker relationship between Israel and the United States. There are some factions who believe in this country that the United States is not an honest broker, but that it actually is too partial to Israel. And one of the fears was, after Donald Trump left office, was that perhaps American foreign policy would swing back and would return to something more like what existed during the time of the Obama administration, when the nature of Israeli-American relations was a little bit more strained. But I am happy to tell you that on a number of issues, both countries have improved relations over the course of these past months and past 6 months. First of all, both Israel and the United States talk about the importance of maintaining a strong relationship with one another with no surprises, leaving no light showing. In talks between the administrations of both countries, there have been close cooperation between the military and the foreign officials to guarantee that there are no surprises on either side, that Israel will do nothing to surprise its American ally and embarrass it, and that for its part, the United States will do nothing to undermine or to put Israel in a difficult position vis-a-vis, its own situation in the Middle East. So long as Israel and the United States maintain strong relationships and they are supportive of one another, and any disagreements that occur are discussed behind the scenes, and it does not become a public issue between the two governments, to the extent that the United States and Israel can remain tightly connected with each other, it will make both of them more effective. What does Joe Biden done to continue the relationship? First of all, Biden did not change Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Okay, there were some people who suggested that it could be that the new Biden administration might decide to turn back Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The Biden administration has indicated that that is a done decision. Nothing that is not going to change. Israel continues to be recognized by the American government as the capital of the state of Israel, and the United States continues to maintain its embassy in Jerusalem with full relations between the two countries. That is something that is not changed. Number two, okay, the United States has also recognized or not changed the recognition that Trump gave to Israel's sovereignty of the Golan Heights that took place in 1967. In 1967, at the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had taken control of the Golan Heights. The Trump administration recognized Israel's right to sovereignty over the Golan. Now, while the Biden administration thought that, while the Democratic administrations before that time thought that was an ill-conceived idea, Biden has done nothing to change the recognition of Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights by Trump. Number three, Israeli settlements, which just before Trump became president, Israel was condemned by the international community because the international community and the United States abstained in the vote, said that Israeli settlements across the 67 borders were illegal according to international law. Trump went ahead and recognized the legality of certain Israeli settlements in the territories. The Biden administration has not changed that policy. It has restricted it a little bit, but basically the Biden administration has not gone back to what was the position of previous administrations, saying that Israeli settlements in territories outside the 1967 borders is inherently illegitimate. Next, the United States has supported Israel's attempt to normalize relationships with the surrounding Arab countries. You'll remember that under the Trump administration, Israel held a series of talks with the Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco. These agreements were contained in what was called the Abraham Accords. And Israel has since that time established relationships with formal relationships with a number of Arab countries, and is in the process of increasing its contacts and developing relationships with others. The Biden administration remains committed to facilitating the normalization of relationships that began with the Abraham Accords, and will do whatever is in its power to guarantee that those ongoing improved negotiations continue. Just two more quick areas. When Biden became president, you will remember that Israel was under attack from Gaza, and they were firing thousands of missiles from Gaza into Israel. And you will remember that Biden came under some pressure from elements of the Democratic Party to stop Israel or to condemn Israel for protecting itself by striking targets in Gaza that were launching these missiles. Biden supported Israel during this critical period of attack. It supported Israeli airstrikes and justified Israel's right to defend itself against these missile attacks against its civilians. Not only did they defend and support Israel's right to meet these terrorist attacks, but in the aftermath of that war, Biden and the Democrats in Congress, together with the Republicans, voted to replenish the missiles that Israel expended in its Iron Dome defense system. They voted to resupply and provide Israel with weapons, with missiles to replace the missiles that were used in Iron Dome, and to give Israel additional financial and military support that it needed. And this was despite the fact that there were some in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who was urging the United States to cut off all military supplies to Israel and isolate Israel until Israel agreed to make certain concessions in its negotiations in the Middle East. Finally, there are ongoing talks and negotiations between Israel and the United States on a number of issues. They talk regularly. There are military discussions, political discussions that are taking place right now. Just recently, Defense Minister Benny Gantz was in Washington. He spoke with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State. He spoke with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. He spoke with other officials about military and government matters concerning joint U.S. tactics with regard to not only Iran, but with regard to other regional challenges. The cooperation between Israel and the U.S. is extremely close, and even military exercises have been planned. Interestingly, as something I didn't know, Israel recently purchased 4 KC-46A tanker fuelers. What are these? These are large tankers, these large fuelers. They're aircraft that can be placed in the air, that can refuel aircraft in the air. If Israel were ever to have to conduct an operation against Iran, given the distance between Israel and Iran and the time it would take to refuel and fly back out, Israel has purchased 4 of these these air tankers, which are due for delivery in the next 2 years, which would enable Israel, if it was necessary, to sustain a campaign of long distance so that its aircraft did not have to return to refuel, but could refuel in the air. And this agreement has been supported and concluded. All these areas are areas of cooperation. Now, I don't want to leave you with the thought that everything is rosy when it comes to this particular area. Obviously, there have been some changes since Biden came into office in January. Number one, the United States is interested in restarting talks with the Palestinians. It was felt that Donald Trump, in his reaction to the Palestinians, in discounting their participation, in turning a cold shoulder, some people said, to the Palestinian issue, he had alienated the Palestinians. So the Biden administration is seeking to return to a situation where the United States can be perceived as a moderator, an intermediary between the two parties. What that means is that the United States has begun to fund again the Palestinians economically. Since they took office in the last 4 months, the United States has sent over $300 million of assistance to the Palestinians in the territories and money for developing and redeveloping and repairing the damage done in the Gaza Strip. The United States has reached out to certain Palestinian interests and made it clear that the United States would be willing to intercede and become more active in any kind of Israeli-Palestinian talks. The United States, in an effort to get the Palestinians to return to the talks, while it did not remove the American embassy from Jerusalem, while it recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the United States did agree to try and open a consulate in East Jerusalem that would deal with Palestinian affairs. Now, Israel is tremendously resistant to this idea for a variety of reasons. And this, by the way, is an area we can talk about. It's a potential area of conflict and division between Israel and America. But the United States is trying to restore its bona fides, its credentials, to be able to serve as an intermediary, as a moderator between Israel and the Palestinians. No one expects the talks to resume quickly, but there is a belief that if the United States can convince the Palestinians that it is looking after their interests as well, that perhaps the Palestinians will agree to, if not reopen talks, at the very least agree to other kinds of halfway measures to begin to relieve the tensions between the two sides. The United States is asking Israel, for example, and the Palestinians to take no proactive moves. Neither side should take unilateral moves that will change the status quo. For Israel's part, this brings me to my third issue, the United States has asked Israel to hold off the expansion and development of new settlements, especially in new areas. The United States is urging the government of Bennett not to announce new settlement activity, not to expand settlements, not to requisition new areas, because the United States fears that any kind of further Israeli settlement policy will only guarantee that the Palestinians won't come back to the table. The United States is also asking Israel to halt a series of evacuations. There are evacuations that are taking place in certain neighborhoods where Israelis are trying to reestablish their property rights in certain communities, and certain Arab communities are being evicted where they have no legal rights, or where they've created or established building projects that they weren't entitled to. Israel has begun taking action. The United States said to Israel, be very careful. The last thing we want to see is an international incident with Israeli troops trying to evict Arab tenants in certain areas and a blow up, and that will only cause the situation to spiral and become less conducive for a solution. The United States is urging the Palestinians to lower the rhetoric. We've always done this, not to pay terrorists in prisons or their families salaries, which is seen as being supporting terrorism, to monitor and to censor books that are used in the Palestinian territories that still preach jihad and struggle in the destruction of the state of Israel. What basically the United States is trying to do is they are trying to get rid of these provocative areas, these areas of provocation, so that the whole region is thrown into further controversy. The problem, of course, and we can talk about this now too as I conclude, the government of Naftali Bennett supports the idea of settlements. One of the things that holds this government together, Bennett's own party, supports the ideas of settlements, supports the idea of the right of Israelis to be able to dwell in all parts of Israel. They support the rights of Jews to be able to pray in certain places, to have access to certain traditional places of Jewish life, like Jerusalem, like Hebron, like other areas. They support the right of Jews to live normal lives, and therefore they are very vulnerable to people who suggest they are going soft on these policies. Right now, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Likud, and the opposition faction are doing everything they can to take advantage of whatever problems and tensions exist with the purpose of trying to cause the Bennett coalition to fail. What you have to understand is Bennett is in the middle of a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he has to keep his government afloat, which means he cannot go back on certain commitments or promises that got him into government, including his belief of the right of the Jewish people to settle in the land of Israel. But on the other hand, he wants to not placate, but he wants to cooperate as much as possible with the Biden administration. He wants to try and repair damaged relations between Israel and democratic factions, especially on the left. So Biden is in this very difficult position where he's trying to keep everybody happy and at the same time maintain his government. So these issues, the issues of the Iran talks, the issues of Israeli sovereignty and settlements and the development of Jewish life in Israel, the issue of negotiations and relationships between Israel and the Palestinian groupings, states, and other interests around them. Those are the three major issues that will confront us over the course of the coming year. Now, I'm going to stop here. I realize I talked for 45 minutes, and I will give you at least a half hour, if you wanted, to raise any other questions. But I just thought it was important to outline completely the areas of contention, as I see it, between Israel and the United States in the coming year. Does anybody want to start with an observation or anything? And just if you do, I'll ask you to unmute yourself. Go ahead, Joseph, go ahead.
Rabbi, it was interesting when you were talking about the nuclear talks, the nuclear agreement with Iran started by the Obama administration. I thought that the goal was to restrict Iran, allowing Iran to enrich uranium or plutonium to the point where they can use it for nuclear energy needs, but not enrich beyond for bomb needs. And I would think that that would be in both nations' interest. Do I have that wrong then?
No, you don't have that wrong, Joseph. You have that right. Part of the agreement, the original agreement, was that Iran would have the right to pursue the development of nuclear energy for peaceful domestic purposes. But that means that they could only enrich up to a certain point. It meant that certain kinds of materials that they possessed at the time, which were over, that had to be turned over, turned over. They could not maintain stores. It restricted the amount of centrifuges they could have and whatnot. When the agreement was reached, the idea was this would provide a period of time in which Iran would be restricted in what it could do. The only problem with that agreement was that it was phased in over a certain period of time. After that time, it was unclear whether Iran could go ahead and then pursue what it wanted to. And there were many people who thought that Iran would abide by that and even cheat a little bit, but stay within the boundaries and continue quietly to develop their technology. And then when the time came, when that time limit ran out, they would just jump to the last stage to nuclear grade weaponry. But you are right. The original agreement was to provide Iran with the rights to have nuclear energy for domestic purposes, for the purposes of energy, but not to allow them to develop weapon grades materials that could be used for offensive purposes. That's it exactly.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead, Mark.
So I'm going to take what some people might consider a hardline position.
Okay.
And say that it is not in Iran's interest to restrict development of nuclear weapons. Iran is a pariah state. They understand that they are a pariah state. And if you are a pariah state, what is it that keeps you in power? Well, look at North Korea. North Korea is a pariah state, and you said once you have nukes, it changes the game. If North Korea didn't have nukes, then that regime would probably be in danger. Mm-hmm. And the regime in Iran is unpopular domestically, and they don't care. They don't care about repressing their population. They want to stay in power. And they see having nukes as the guarantor of their staying in power. They have no interest in not developing nukes.
Okay. If that is the case, Mark, if Iran has made the calculation that its safety ultimately depends on their development of nuclear weapons, then this is going to end badly, whatever the scenario. The truth is that the United States and the world does not want to see Iran become a nuclear power. And when they act together in unison and sanctions are strong, they have been managing to create a situation which has created a certain instability, Mark, in Iran. You're right. The Ayatollahs, for various reasons, might want nuclear weapons, but they have to weigh the price of developing nuclear weapons against the economic problems, the economic sanctions they will confront if the world actually perceives them as moving toward it. If they have nobody to stand with them, if China isn't going to help them, and if Pakistan is not going to help them, and if the West determined that they were serious about obtaining nuclear weapons and seriously impose serious sanctions on Iran, they could make it very difficult for Iran to continue. But Mark, the realization has always been that if it was perceived that Iran was rushing toward a nuclear potential, that the United States and or Israel and others would not sit back and allow that to happen. I must tell you that if it were determined that the Iranians were determined to get the bomb, the military option, the military response is not off the table. That everybody agrees with. We will attempt not to do it that way. We will attempt to try and negotiate. Countries will try and keep their ties open, their trade ties with Iran if they can. But if it becomes apparent, Mark, what you've said is true, that the Iranians are hell-bent on developing a nuclear weapon, then even if other nations are not interested, there are certain nations who will not let that happen, okay?
Good luck with that.
Yeah, I understand. Elise, go ahead.
I've been to Israel 5 times. I have quite a few Israeli friends, both in Israel and here. I've yet to hear one of them think that Biden is a friend to Israel. One of my friends in Israel has a brother-in-law who was involved in making the Iron Dome. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to break the fast with him one year. And he explained to me that the majority of money that the United States sends to the Palestinians is used to build tunnels or to go to terrorists. It's not going to build hospitals and schools. And if some money goes to hospitals and schools, the Palestinians use them as places to shoot missiles into Israel. They're very unhappy about the consulate that might go into for the Palestinians in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And they think that this is a very, very bad situation. The Biden administration has a lot of people who are very outspoken against Israel. And I've yet to hear President Biden say anything contradicting what they say. Even the Jewish members of Congress have not stood up for Israel. Right. So I think there's a very big difference between the last administration, which I know had a lot of flaws, but most Israelis that I know think that they never had a better friend in an American president than Trump, and the opposite with Biden. Right. Or at least better than Obama, but still bad.
All right. Recognizing that this is a minefield in which I can only be terribly injured, if not killed, I'm going to proceed with great caution here. All right. Allow me to say that I disagree with your characterization of Biden as not being supportive of Israel. On the contrary, Joe Biden, I think, in his kishkas, has long been a friend of Israel. I know that there are people who developed a different attitude toward Joe Biden when he was vice president of the United States under Barack Obama. Many people who have developed this attitude that Biden is not a friend of Israel came to this conclusion because of Biden's lack of comment or lack of pushback during the Obama years. But what you have to understand is a vice president does not push back against a sitting president. Joe Biden has been, I mean, Hal, maybe you will want to talk about it, but I think over the years, Joe Biden has been a consistent friend of Israel and the Jewish state and has had a lot of close personal ties with a lot of Israelis. It is true, Elise, that there are elements in the Democratic Party today, in one wing of the party, especially the progressive portion of the party, that are taking a different attitude toward Israel than the party has taken in the past. Part of that has to do with the relationship between Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. Yeah, part of it has to deal with the fact that in a number of issues, liberals on this Israel issue take different positions. I'm not arguing that, but I think given the pressures that he's had to deal with, my own impression is that Joe Biden on certain critical issues, I'm thinking especially of the attacks on Israel during the Gaza war, was tremendously supportive. How you keep an eye on these political things. What's your impression about the Biden administration vis-a-vis Israel?
Well, I think great discussion so far, great topic, great input. I mean, there's no question about it. You know, what Joseph said, what Elise said, what Mark said, they're all valid, even though people come from a different political perspective. And I think one of the drivers, going back to 1948, of Israel policy, of impact on presidents and vice presidents, is the State Department, which has, from the very beginning of Israel, which had fought tooth and nail, and Harry Truman had to use hard-ass tactics to get Israel recognized and pushed it through the United Nations. He used to call the State Department guys the striped pants boys from Harvard and Yale and Princeton in particular. Mostly Christian, mostly anti-Semites. They thought Israel was just a pain in the neck. The Arab world, which no Arab country voted for Israel in 1948 for the founding of the state of Israel, because of oil, because of the Saudis, because of energy. And I think over the years, whether it was John Foster Dulles under the Eisenhower administration, under Truman, under Kennedy, Republican or Democrat, you know, it didn't matter. James Baker, you know, who used to say, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyways. And it's really been a consistent policy of the State Department to give not a lot of slack to Israel, because they believe the small country, which has great leverage in the Middle East, but against all the other countries, it's really a detriment. So I think the State Department, even though everybody says, well, Tony Blinken is Jewish and lost his family in the Holocaust, and that's horrible, and that's to be respected. You know, they have been lukewarm on the Abraham Accords. They have not been really endorsing that. Why is that? Because they still are hung up on this two-state solution with the Palestinians. A two-state solution will never, ever happen. And why won't it happen? Not because the Israelis don't want it. The Palestinians have rejected every offer, every attempt at a two-state solution. There haven't been talks for years. Even Sharon, you know, begged the Palestinians to talk. Abbas is corrupt. He's sick. He's old. He's been in power for 16 years and no elections. So all these forces are, and the Palestinians in Israel versus Gaza, they fight amongst themselves, and Hamas could very well become the ruling party. And so what are you dealing with? A country whose charter says, let's destroy Israel. So right. Biden is whipsawed by all of this. Bennett is whipsawed by all of this. So at the end of the day, nothing's going to happen on a two-state solution. You are right that the biggest issue is Iran. And I think Iran is looking at the United States and said, boy, in the last 15, 20 years, they've messed up every foreign policy adventure you can imagine, including Afghanistan. And they're saying they're never going to send troops. They're not going to send aircraft carriers. So the Ayatollahs, and I'll end with this, have basically said, and they've cheated from day one. They hoodwinked Obama. They hoodwinked Biden. They hoodwinked all the negotiators. They were always developing nuclear weapons underground in Osirak or whatever it's called.
That was Iraq, right? Yeah.
And if it wasn't for Israel screwing them up, you know, on the internet and assassinating some of their leaders, they'd be even farther ahead. They're going to develop whatever they're going to develop because they don't see any price they have to pay, and they don't believe the U.S. will intervene. And the Ayatollah said about 10 years ago, you know, if we exchange nuclear bombs, and I'll end on this, if we exchange nuclear bombs, yeah, we may lose 5, 8, 10 million people in Iran, but we're a country of 50 million people. We can wipe out Israel, a country of 9 million people, and we'd pay the price because we've always believed that we will wipe Israel from the face of the earth, and they're still bound by that.
Okay. Anybody want to follow that happy note?
This is Ike.
And
Oh, by the way, just one recommendation.
Yes.
There are a couple of terrific books. Ron, you know them. 1948 by Benny Morris. That was about and all the war, what happened with the Palestinians. And there is an outstanding book by a historian named Ronald Radosh called A Safe Haven. It's a fascinating look at all the stuff I just said about the creation of the state of Israel, how Harry Truman should be lionized. He should have a statue and a square in Israel for what he did to create Israel, and how the State Department started all this, which continues to. It's a great read.
It is.
It is fascinating. I think you'll all love it. Get it on Amazon for $8 or something. It's a thick book, but it goes quick. It's a terrific historical book.
It is a good book. Jerry, you had a response. I think it was Jerry. Is that Jerry?
Yes, hi there. Rabbi, you'd mentioned some really fascinating things considering this, and I looked up some quick facts. In 2019, the approximate military aid to Israel was $3.8 billion. Now, curiously, as you had mentioned, with the cost that it would take to have a better security in the Middle East without Israel, I also noted the US was putting in over $5 billion a year in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Yes. And secondly, the US indeed was the first country to recognize Israel as a state.
Yeah, Jerry, I think you've pointed out something very important. If you take into account what the United States pays on sending troops over and developing weaponry and whatnot, what the United States has received over the course of the, we're going on what, 70 some odd years now, almost 80 years since Israel became a state, what it has achieved for a very little investment far exceeds what they would have spent if they'd had to replace, had to develop security in the region themselves. It was a small cost to pay, and the payoff in terms of also military intelligence and equipment that Israel captured has more than paid for what Israel receives. It was a beneficial relationship on both sides. Here's my question to some of you, just to think about. We know what it is like being in the United States now, with Israel being a topic of conversation. For most of us, it doesn't affect our day-to-day lives unless we have children that are on college campuses, perhaps, and college campuses and whatnot seem to be the main theater on which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is playing out here in the United States. But basically, we have not, especially since the end of the Gaza war, we have not heard a lot about what's happening in Israel. We have our own problems with anti-Semitism. We have our own problems with people suggesting that Jews are responsible for the COVID virus. That kind of thing is still going on, and that kind of those kind of suggestions from both the left and the right are still there. Interestingly enough, the tone of the dialogue between Israel and the United States over the last 6 months has been a lot less acrimonious than it was either during the Obama administration or during many of the years of the Trump administration. Contrary, I think, to what some of you had said, I think in terms of ongoing relationships and keeping each other informed and not surprising each other, I think the Biden-Bennett relationship so far, considering that both governments are dealing with a number of different factors, both foreign and domestic, has been remarkably stable and remarkably close. It seems to me that Israel and the United States are doing everything that they can. The United States does not want to see Bibi Netanyahu back in power. Certainly Biden doesn't. And I think the Israelis, for their part, want to create the misimpression in the United States that Israel is a Republican issue or a Republican concern and not a Democratic concern. In order to repair some of the damage that has been done, I think both countries have been working very diligently to try and create a bipartisan atmosphere between Washington and Jerusalem to let people know that the U.S.-Israel relationship is on sounder ground. That was my impression. I don't know if anybody else feels that way. Go ahead. Oh,
This is Ike. Can I?
yeah, go ahead, Ike.
Yeah, when you were covering the events that took place where the Israelis bought 4 planes that would, when you have planes that have to go long distances and they have to be refueled. So they bought 4 planes, which were supposed to be delivered, I think, in 1924.
Correct.
Well, at this point, the Israelis are making preparations for a time when they may have to attack Iran because they develop an atom bomb. So they asked the United States if they can have 2 of the planes delivered next year. So that would give them a leg up a little bit on their ability to do that. The United States refused. They would not deliver those planes earlier, 2 years earlier than originally sought.
I followed that, Ike. I know exactly what you are referring to. It's not quite as black and white as you make it sound. Yes, it is true that the planes were supposed to be delivered in 2024. Part of the problem for the delay was, in fact, the Israeli government postponed the actual ordering. There was a sense in which the Israeli government dropped the ball by not going ahead with the procurement faster. These planes, by the way, are being procured by Boeing. They're Boeing planes. And it takes a certain amount of time to develop them, to give them the capability. Israel initially delayed on the ordering of these planes. If you look into the background, you see that it was Netanyahu, for various reasons, who had to do with the elections and whatnot, and pushed back the ordering of these planes, had to do with the economy. So that, yeah, it is true that the United States is not now doing anything to accelerate the delivery of these planes before 2024. But it is also clear that Israel was responsible by its own procrastination for this whole thing taking as much time that it did. If these could have been ordered and it would have been further along had Israel not procrastinated. So it's a mixed issue. It is a mixed issue.
Well, that's considered by the Israeli military. That's considered a
vital. Yeah, but I am not convinced that if Israel decides to go this, I don't think it's going to go it alone. I mean, my own feeling is that Israel is not going to strike without at least without notifying the U.S. government. And my feeling is that if it ever gets to that point, Erwin, that you're talking about, where Israel considers where it considers military action, that at that point, the United States probably will also have tried to do everything it could to stop it. And Israel may not be acting alone in that situation. It may not have to worry about supplying its own nuclear refuelers. It may have some help. Hal and then Joseph, go ahead.
Well, if you look at the so-called world community, I don't have much confidence that they would come to the aid of Israel. It's never happened, even though if Iran, will develop a bomb. And by the way, the original agreements were only a 10-year delay, and then all bets are off. So 10 years goes by in a heartbeat. But I do believe that Joe Biden is a friend of Israel. I really do. Going back to his historical record. Yes, he was shackled by Obama, who had other objectives. And of course, the Netanyahu speaking before Congress was a terrible mistake on his part, terrible mistake. But, when they had the Iron Dome debate in Congress and they kind of delayed it and they waited, I think Joe Biden put a lot of pressure on Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to get the deal done. And, you play games, you trade, you horse trade it and all that. And what's also not helping Biden, you mentioned all the issues you're totally on, is you have a couple of other players mucking around in the Middle East. one longtime mucker in the Middle East, and that's Russia,
Yes.
which Putin, of course, is trying to make into the old Soviet Union again. And number two is a new player in the game, China, Syria and all that. And Pakistan, too, helping consult with Iran on the bomb. So I don't envy Joe Biden and what he's got to deal with so many miles away. But I do think he is a friend of Israel. He is just hamstrung by so much related and unrelated to the Middle East right now.
No, I agree. And he's got his own series of problems to deal with too. I think my other thought is, Hal, and I hopefully you see the same. I think the last thing Biden needs now is another area of instability. He's going to do everything he can to keep the lid on, to hopefully keep things calm in the Middle East with help from supportive Arab governments and whatnot. With what's going on with China and Russia and Ukraine, and COVID, the last thing we need is more instability in the Middle East. I agree. Joseph, you going to say something?
Yes. Rabbi, I think I'm with you down the line. I was, the Obama and Benji Netanyahu, that was a bad relationship, and I was a little concerned there. And I think I could be objective here because, I'm not Jewish. I was concerned about in those times about that. The US and Israel need a strong relationship in the past and going forward. And I do believe that their mutual interests, it'll always be aligned together. And I was, and Trump and Benji did a strange kind of dance that was a little concerning to me. When Biden got elected, I was a little afraid because Benji was still in office. But I thought that when Bennett got elected, I thought that this would be a great reset. And I am entirely optimistic on Biden and Bennett. And I want anyone to challenge me if I'm wrong, but I am entirely optimistic that this is a total reset. And we share so much mutual interest. I can't help but to think that that Bennett and Biden, the two State Departments, are going to come together and achieve something wonderful for both countries.
Well, that's my hope, Joseph. And, I thought relationships were very close, but after hearing Donald Trump this last week talk about his secret feelings about Bibi Netanyahu not ever wanting peace,
Exactly.
That could just be a reaction. But
so we erase both of them. I mean, we erase both of them and let's start anew. And I think that it's a great chance for a reset.
Yeah, the trouble is you can't erase either of them because Bibi continues to be an influence in Israeli politics. And we know that Donald Trump continues to be an influence in American politics.
But Rabbi, both might be in jail within a year. I mean, trials for Bibi and trials for Trump. I mean, both may be.
That's true. And then we'll all bake them cakes, hopefully without files of them. Okay. Sorry. Leslie, go ahead. And then Erwin.
Well, what you guys were just talking about, you can't forget the Christian right needs Israel to survive. So I always felt that Trump was an anti-Semite from the beginning because I'm from the East Coast and I know him. But he wasn't playing to the Jews anyway. He was using his daughter being married, but he has been all along playing to the Christian right. And Israel is very important to stay there because Christ is coming back and it has to be there and it can't be with the Arabs.
Donald Trump has essentially said what you've said, Leslie. He castigated American Jews. He said evangelical Christians love Israel more than the Jewish people.
And they do.
Trump could not get his mind around the fact that Jews could be Democrats because after everything Donald Trump was doing for the state of Israel, recognizing Jerusalem as its capital, recognizing Jewish sovereignty in the Golan Heights, the improved relations, Trump must have been saying to himself, Jews got to love me. And they weren't loving him, okay? Even with his Israel decisions, they weren't. And he said recently, Jews don't love Israel as much as they should. She's suggesting that American Jews, almost suggesting that their first loyalty to be, he said, I loved Israel more than the Jews did. The evangelical Christians cared more about them. The truth, though, is that a lot of what the Trump administration did vis-a-vis Israel was not only for the sake of Jewish Americans, it was for the sake of a whole great number of evangelical Christians who continue, by the way, to warn Trump, be very careful what you say, because while they may support him in other things, that I have heard comments in recent days saying, if you do anything that shows you are opposed to the interests of Israel, we are not going to follow you. So those evangelicals, for whatever their reason, Leslie, they remain an important group within the American body politic, an important support group for Israel interests. I think you're right. Let's see, who else? Erwin, go ahead.
Okay, so I've heard one comment tonight, and I've heard comments along these lines in the past. And I'm absolutely totally convinced that when it comes to the Iron Dome, the United States does not get the credit it deserves. And just to put it in perspective, without going into a lot of detail, the Iron Dome is an offshoot of a system called the Patriot Missile System.
And it is.
Defense system. And when the Patriot Missile Defense System was in its early phases of development, Israel had a need to develop quickly a system of protecting itself. And the United States gave them that early version of the Patriot system. The problem with that system, however, was that even though it resided in Israel, it was operated by U.S. personnel, by the way. It resided in Israel. The United States was not prepared to provide Israel with the technology associated with the software, the targeting, the voting software, voting between target A, target B, get that missile, not get that missile, and the reasons beyond that. The United States was not prepared to provide that level of insight. So all the mathematics, all the targeting was done in the United States. Now, you know how the system, how the internet works. It's very quick. It's near instantaneous. So that was not a real detriment. The data was acquired by the so-called Patriot system. It was uploaded to a specific spacecraft. That spacecraft transmitted to a relay spacecraft. That relay spacecraft sent it down to a certain base in Alabama, which processed the data, sent the information back, and it was all done in less than just in a few seconds, and it would function. The next step in development of the Iron Dome system was that the United States provided Israel with the hardware, the missile system, which they called the Iron Dome. They provided them the hardware. Israel was allowed to develop their own software that would be embedded into their system. So the Iron Dome, even recently, has been a U.S. hardware, Israeli software. Most recently, Israel has started building its own hardware to the point where now they can build their own system. So my information comes from a period of time when in the time period of 2014, 2015, 2016, who was in power then? Tell me, please.
2014, 15 up till 16, it was Barack Obama.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's when all this
happened. I'm not even quite.
So yeah, we should not jump through over tall buildings to blame one and blame the other and give Israel more credit than they deserve. The United States has been behind Israel through thick and thin for a long time.
All right, and I would only add to that that statement, Erwin, amen. That is why it is always important that Israel remain a bipartisan concern for Democrats and Republicans.
That's absolutely correct.
The truth is that while different administrations have taken different tacks and different strategies, and some have dealt in a more direct way or a more confrontational way than others, the relationship between the United States and Israel, militarily, diplomatically, in so many areas, is mutually beneficial for both. And I would tell you that Israel tests a lot of that equipment. It gets its real testing in Israel, and the technology development that comes from sharing this technology benefits both Israel and the United States. It benefits both countries.
True enough.
All right, well, look, I guess what I'm trying to say is if you thought I was going to talk about an apocalyptic new year, I don't think so. If I am talking about it, it's not going to be Israel. I think, and you can never, don't try and be a prophet on the Middle East. You'll be wrong without question. But my feeling is that barring something we are not seeing, and of course it's what you don't see that gets you, I think for a while, these other major issues that are confronting us are going to take up a lot of our time. We are not. Israel is trying to not let Bibi and Likud sabotage what they're developing and utilizing some of these issues as an attempt to galvanize and to stir up the Israeli public to topple the existing government. I actually honestly believe that the group of progressives on the left of the Democratic Party are not so influential that they're going to change basic democratic attitudes toward Israel. I think we're going to continue to see a strong relationship between the US government now and the Israeli government. And my hope is that the personal chemistry, and I want to second what you say, Joseph, that this reset, as you phrase it, this reset between Biden and Bennett, two men who are both temperamentally very different than the men they replace, that maybe that will set the tone for the new year. And maybe that, plus new realities in the Middle East, including more Arab countries recognizing the benefits of relationship with Israel. I understand Turkey is now rethinking its whole attitude and talking about integrating and reestablishing new relationships with Israel. There are talks about two other Arab states thinking about opening embassies in Israel in the very near future, including, interestingly enough, a non-Arab state. I just recently heard, Hal, you might be interested, that the Ukraine is thinking about opening its embassy in Jerusalem as well. So there's a lot of things that are changing. And as Israel establishes its good intents in the area, I think you're going to see a lot of good things happen in the coming year. I could be wrong, but I'm not an alarmist. I think things are looking like they might not be catastrophic, and maybe we are going to have a reset in relationships. At any rate, just one other thing. Oh, go ahead, Hal.
Great session, by the way. Terrific discussion by everybody. And of course, Ukraine's gonna get involved with Israel. You got a nice Jewish boy, right?
Jewish boy, yeah.
Unless the Russians invade Kiev next week, and then all bets are off. But I think what people also have to recognize is Bennett was part of Likud. He was part of Netanyahu. He's a conservative, right-winger, pro-settlement guy. He is not as incendiary as Netanyahu. But last thing, I'll shut up. What's most interesting is Bennett, in part, owes his government to a lot of factions. But keep in mind the Arab faction, the Israeli Arab faction, that helped put him over the top. And what I find interesting, I forget the guy's name who leads the party. They have not made a lot of noise. They've kind of been going, and I would have thought they would have agitated for the talks and no more settlements, but it's interesting how quiet they've been up to this point.
Yeah, and a lot of people thought they were only going to be quiet until the budget was passed. So they thought that after last month and the budget passing, things were going to come unglued. And the amazing thing is we're into December, and it looks like for a variety of reasons, these parties are holding together despite their different interests and whatnot. So that also was a very unexpectedly good sign. Just a final word, as this is our last meeting for this year. I want to wish everybody a happy new year. And I want to, Cantor Cohen has been sharing with me some information. I just want to share it with you. All of you, and we're not a big group, we're a small group. We're a small group, face it. This year, we have done an incredible thing. We have not only sustained classes over the last year and a half, but I am very proud to say that based on the figures that I have just seen, and I am amazed, and I will be writing to all of you very soon, we have raised between two times, once in May, I think it was, Cantor, and once in December, we have raised just a little under $9,600 for the Jewish Learning Center, $9,600. If you had told me that this was going to happen, it was even going to last, I would have been happy. But to realize that the program goes, I can tell you that I have some, well, I'll just, some important news coming up. Just leave it at that. And I will send you out notice. I will also be sending out words of appreciation. When this COVID thing gets behind us, you, the founders of the Jewish Learning Center, we should do a big Shabbos dinner or maybe an evening out or something, because you are the ones who put this operation together. You were the ones who made it a reality. And as we finish 18 months, I could not be more proud of what we have created, what we have accomplished. May you all have a happy and a healthy end of the year and a good new year. May all your family and friends be well. Be in touch with them, reach out to them, but be safe. Watch yourself, because apparently this Omicron upsurge is real. It's out there. And even those of us who've been vaccinated and boosted, we are not out of the woods completely, although hopefully we're a little bit better. So just do the smart thing, wear your mask.